Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. With us, my name's Louise Birrell. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the Matilda Centre, and I'll be chairing the webinar session today. I'd like to give a warm welcome to both of our speakers for today, Ms. Siobhan Lawler and Daniel McFadden, who are both postgraduate research students here at the Matilda Centre, and presenting on their research which falls within the crime research portfolio that we conduct at the Matilda Centre. So to introduce Siobhan, she's a PhD candidate here at the Matilda Centre at the University of Sydney, and Siobhan's research examines the links between drug use, aggression and violence amongst young people. Her research interests include violence prevention, sentencing, youth mental health, drug and alcohol and organised crime. And prior to her current role, Siobhan was based at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, or NDARC, at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. We'll also have joining us after Siobhan, Daniel McFadden. Daniel is a social worker at the Forensic Hospital of New South Wales and a registered social worker in both Ireland and Australia. Mr. McFadden is currently completing a Masters of Philosophy at the University of Sydney, and his research interests include dual diagnosis, violent offending, gender and criminal justice. Mr. McFadden received a New South Wales Higher Education and Training Institute Mental Health Research Award in 2019. So we're really lucky to have both Siobhan and Daniel to join us today and tell us about the research that they're conducting. But before we move on to their research topics, there's a few administrative areas I'd like to quickly cover. So firstly, I want to let you know we are recording today's session, and within the next day or two, I'll send out a link of the recording in case you'd like to view this again and download the slides and handouts that we'll be showing. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the question and answer buttons that appear at the bottom of your screen. So please do feel free to click on these and type in any questions or comments that you might have at any time during the presentations. And we'll have some time at the end of the session to go through these questions and comments and have a bit of a question and answer session. If you do experience any technical difficulties, any issues with sound or viewing us, please visit the Zoom support webpage, which has support options, or use the chat box and we can look into any issues that you're having. So firstly, I thought for those of you who may not be familiar with the Matilda Centre or the work that we do, I'll give a brief overview of the team. So this is a photo of the team based at the Matilda Centre at the University of Sydney. Oh, sorry, I've just skipped ahead a slide. Sorry, I'll go back to the previous one. So the Matilda Centre was established in 2018. We were formerly known as the Centre of Research Excellence in Mental Health or Substance Use, and based at the University of New South Wales, but moved to the University of Sydney and became the Matilda Centre last year. So at the Matilda Centre, we focus on conducting research to improve our understanding of mental health and substance use disorders, and develop and trial innovative prevention and early intervention, treatment and translation programs related to these problems. And to achieve this work, we work very closely with services, schools and community groups. And this webinar series is another way for us to keep those lines of communication open. So next we can see our team here again, and our director is circled there in yellow, Professor Marie Thiessen. So Marie leads research here and is a Principal Research Fellow and Director of the NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in the Prevention of Mental Illness and Substance Use Premise. And in 2018, Marie was appointed by the Minister for Health, Greg Hunt, as National Mental Health Commissioner in recognition of her work. She's also been awarded a Companion of the Order of Australia, which demonstrates her major contribution to Australia's health and medical research efforts, particularly in the field of mental health and substance use. So without any further ado, it's now my absolute pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Siobhan Lawler and Daniel McFadden. So a big thank you for joining us today. We're really lucky to have you both with us, and I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting session. So I'm now going to hand over to Siobhan, and I'll come back again at the end for our question and answer session. Thanks, Siobhan.
Great, thank you, Lou. Thanks to everyone who's joining us. So as Lou said, I'm Siobhan and I'm a third year PhD student here at the Matilda Centre. And I'm going to talk about one of my studies that I have been doing as part of my PhD, which is looking at themes in judges' sentencing remarks, sentencing young adults charged with serious violent crimes. So let's jump in. I'll give a bit of an overview of the talk. So I'll just begin by explaining who it is that we are talking about today when we say young adult offenders, and the context in which we're talking about them. And then I'll explain how this relates to my research questions and the methodology that we use to examine these in our study. And then I'll talk about some of our findings, some of the key issues raised and the conclusions from the research. And then I'll hand over to Daniel. So let's get started. So we'll start off by setting the scene. Who are we talking about when we're talking about young adult offenders? So in my context, I'm talking about young people aged 18 to 25, but the definition can extend to age 30. And young adult offenders tend to have these multiple and composite needs that are characterised by a range of static and dynamic risk factors. And these span across the individual, the social, and the environmental. And so involvement in the criminal justice system, it tends to compound upon this disadvantage that relates to housing, employment, and mental health issues, to name a few, that can often lead people there in the first place. And efforts to intervene early and divert and rehabilitate and reintegrate justice-involved young people. And these are impeded by various challenges that are associated with a lack of coordination across these siloed health, criminal justice and welfare services and systems. And in Australia, certain groups are significantly overrepresented in our criminal justice system. So young people, particularly young men, people with a disability, whether this is a substance use disorder, a mental health disorder, an intellectual disability or a cognitive disability, an acquired brain injury, people with a history of trauma and maltreatment, people with a history of out-of-home care, experiences of out-of-home care and general disadvantage. However, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are now the most incarcerated people, and not just in Australia, but in the world. And despite making up only 3% of our population, they constitute 27% of the prison population. And this is higher and lower in different states and territories. But in New South Wales, in youth justice settings, it's 50%. And there is this really strong relationship between drug use and crime, particularly violent crime, where the majority of young people in custody have alcohol and other drug-related problems. So 3/4 of juveniles are intoxicated at the time of their offence, 2/3 report committing crime to obtain alcohol and other drugs, 1/3 of adults attribute their offending to their substance use, especially alcohol, which is implicated in anywhere from 30 to 70% of all violent crime committed. And so how should judges take this into account? Well, this is a really divisive issue, and it's been a problem for sentencing courts for many years. The accepted approach is that it can't be used as an excuse. The law tends to treat people as accountable for making a choice to embark on drug taking, but this becomes more complex when drug use is accompanied by mental health problems, which, as we know, these two things commonly co-occur and exacerbate each other. Sentencing is an extremely complex practice. There are so many things that judges need to take into account in their decision-making process. Public opinion surveys tend to find that judges are too lenient, that they're out of touch, or that they're soft on crime. However, there is some really great, interesting research by Professor Kate Warner and her colleagues in Tasmania, looking at jurors as a proxy for more informed members of the public. And what they have found is that when jurors are properly informed of all the things that judges need to take into account in their decision-making process, they actually tend to make more lenient recommendations for sentencing than judges do. And so some of these things that judges need to take into account when sentencing, or their aims in sentencing, can be summarised as retribution or punishment, general and specific deterrence, community protection, reparation and rehabilitation. Judges' remarks contain really rich data and they are freely available. There have been previous applications, but arguably they've been underutilised as a resource for understanding how young adults in particular are processed through the courts. And so this is what led us to embark on our study. And we had two research questions. We wanted to know what was the role of alcohol and other drugs in violent crime committed by young adults. And we also wanted to know how judges were talking about their rehabilitation. So judges' sentencing remarks from higher courts, New South Wales higher courts from 2014 to 2017 were extracted from the Australian legal database AUSLI. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with AUSLI, it is a joint venture by the UTS and UNSW faculties of law. And it's an online portal, basically, that provides free access to legal materials, resources such as legislation, law reform and Royal Commission reports, and decisions such as judges' sentencing remarks. It's a really wonderful resource. You can systematically search the database using keywords, and this is what we did. So we searched the judgments, we searched for judgments relating to violent crime from the New South Wales Higher Courts. So we looked at the District Court and the Supreme Court, and we identified 507 judgments in this search. About 3/4 of these had mention of alcohol and other drugs. And when we screened for remarks sentencing young adults charged with violence involving drugs and alcohol, 51 transcripts were included in our final analysis. The study was mixed methods. This is an example of the coding scheme that you can see here. This was used to guide the data extraction process. It was developed through a process of refinement using the data and the research as a guide. And the categories include offence characteristics, offender characteristics, and sentencing characteristics and outcomes. What you see here is an example of the first page of a typical judgment. So these judgments are a verbatim transcript that explain the judge's reasons for a sentence to those who are involved in the case. They include a summary of the offence, details about the offender and any victims, and information about the purpose of the sentence. So what did we find? In our sample, we had 90% male, 88% had criminal history, 41% had co-occurring disorders, 1/3 of this sample was from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, and 61% were on conditional liberty, meaning that they were on bond or parole at the time of the offence. Homicide and robbery were the most common offences in this sample, but it's important that I emphasise here, this is reflecting the serious nature of crimes that are processed through the higher courts, not the prevalence of these crimes in the lower courts or in the community. Now, on the other hand, you can see that there was only one case of sexual assault that was identified in these judgments. This is a little bit more representative of how few of these cases actually go to trial, with about 1 in 10 reported cases resulting in a conviction. The majority of cases occurred in rural and regional areas and in residential settings. Alcohol and methamphetamine were the primary drugs involved in violent crimes analysed, and this is in line with what we know about well-documented links between alcohol and violence, as well as recent increases in help among young adults for help seeking for methamphetamine dependence in Australia. Cannabis and benzodiazepine use was also present, but commonly in the context of polydrug use. And the judge identified that an offender had a substance use disorder in 39% of cases. So comorbidity, this is where a person is described as having 2 or more co-occurring disorders. This was discussed in 41% of cases, and about 1 in 3 of all people in the sample had co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. And this is in line with research showing high rates of comorbidity among people in contact with the criminal justice system. And this research shows that offenders that have substance use, mental health comorbidity offend at a higher rate than those who have either a mental health disorder or a substance use disorder alone. So effective rehabilitation with this group can have really significant benefits, not just for the individual, but for the community as well. in this table here, it outlines the framework that we use to examine motivations for offending. And we took these from Sutherland and colleagues' study on motivations for crime among people who inject drugs. So they originally developed these categories based on findings from the Australian Institute of Criminology Drug Use Monitoring in Australia study, where they interviewed detainees about their crimes. The categories that they identified were financial, so needed money to buy drugs, support oneself or pay debts. Opportunistic, this was a large category. It's talking a lot about impulsive crime, enjoyed the rush, lost temper, looking for revenge, urged by friends, kind of just acting on that spur of the moment. Psychopharmacological is under the influence or withdrawal. And self-defense, this relates to where there was a perceived threat in which the violence was the response. So here you can see the most common motivations as described by judges in their remarks were financial reasons, followed by opportunistic, with psychopharmacological reasons less common, and only one case in which it was described as being in self-defense. So as you can see, that as we saw, there was a really high prevalence of financially motivated crime in this sample, so robberies and break and enters, and so maybe this makes sense. However, it is in contrast to research from the original DUMA study, looking at detainees' own attributions and the role of drugs in their offences, and what the majority of detainees say is that the direct effects of the drugs, that's what they attribute their offending behaviour to, with much fewer reporting economic reasons. Getting to our key research questions. So we wanted to see how judges spoke about the offender's drug and alcohol use and the role of alcohol and drugs in violent crimes analysed. And there was this really clear divide in the views expressed by judges in our sample. So the slight majority of judgments recognised the impact of drug and alcohol dependence on offending behaviour, including the psychological, genetic, physical, historical, environmental, mental health influences. However, the remainder spoke a lot more about agency and choice, the choice that they made to commit the crime. And there was this clear narrative of they should have known better, they shouldn't have taken the drug in the first place. But despite this divide, when we're thinking about rehabilitation, we did have the majority of judges in the sample talking a lot about rehabilitation and how important rehabilitation was. So this is a really typical excerpt from the sentencing remarks that we looked at, and it emphasises this narrative of choice and control over use, despite the assumption of psychological and physical dependency on that drug. So here the judge says, those who voluntarily take methamphetamine can scarcely complain when they receive little or no reduction in sentence because their violent offences were committed under the influence of that drug. When he ran out of money, he could not afford to buy the drug anymore, he had a choice. He could have recognised the fact that he could not afford it and just not used it anymore. So the difficulty with treating substance use disorders is well known, with relapse common and in most cases an expected part of the recovery process. And clinical diagnostic criteria clearly states how the inability to cut down and cease use despite a desire to do so is characteristic of such dependence. So this really highlights a disconnect between some judges' views and understanding of the nature of addiction and how, from a health perspective, we've come to understand these issues. So I like this one because it really gets to the difficulty of sentencing these types of offences. So here the judge said, while his mental health does not directly contribute to the commission of the offence, it indirectly does so, in the way it has contributed to his dependence upon alcohol and drugs. To that extent, to a limited extent, of course, his moral culpability is reduced. But of course, the courts have said for time immemorial that drunken people cannot hide behind their drunkenness unless it gives rise to a defence to excuse themselves from serious conduct. So here the judge is recognising the background of disadvantage and trauma and mental health issues and directly links these to the offender's substance use. And you can see how it's complex, because mental health problems, they can be mitigating. They can sort of have the effect of reducing somebody's culpability, whereas alcohol and other drug use tends to sort of lean the other way, increase culpability, especially if somebody knew that they would become violent or under the influence of that drug or any drug. So it's a really difficult thing for mental health professionals to tease apart and for judges to determine in retrospect. It highlights both sides, why it's such a divisive issue, why alcohol and other drugs use can explain this impulsivity and this senselessness in offending behaviour that you see so often, but it can't necessarily excuse it. And judges balancing these competing aims of risk and rehabilitation is this familiar rhetoric, but it's less clear how this occurs in sentencing young violent offenders with substance use problems. And it's recognised that this process is affected by a great many number of factors, some of which are not directly observable and many of which are not reported by judges in their remarks. So in any case, in the case where there is evidence to support the rehabilitative potential of an offender and to promote a rehabilitative purpose in sentencing, judges can make a ruling of special circumstances. So under Section 44 of the Crimes Act, judges can elect to reduce the standard non-parole period, which is typically 3/4 of the head sentence and the minimum time that someone will spend in prison, to increase the amount of time an offender will spend out in the community under supervision on parole. So they're still spending the same amount of time. The sentence is still the same. It's just less time in prison, more time in the community to address these interrelated factors that contribute to their offending behaviour. So we looked at this in our sample, and you can see that special circumstances was found in the majority of cases. And the main reasons for this were general rehabilitation, risk of institutionalisation, and to directly address alcohol and other drug problems. So it does have to be said that a lot of these various criteria that you can see here relating to special circumstances, these are commonplace among people who come into contact with the criminal justice system and don't necessarily indicate an unusual case or experience, which is what we've seen in our sample. But despite this, it is encouraging. It's an encouraging finding, as it's another way that we can see rehabilitation being prioritised as an aim in sentencing. So key issues raised. Firstly, we can say judges in the sample were mostly divided in their opinions around the role of drug use in violent crime, where many were emphasising these conservative views with a focus on an offender's choice to use alcohol and other drugs, and which points to this contradiction in understanding of the nature of addiction and the impact of substance use dependence on individuals. But that being said, withdrawal is difficult, it is not impossible. So, these judges see over and over again the devastation that these violent crimes have on the lives of so many people. However, this narrative of rehabilitation, really shows recognition for the potential of reintegration into the broader community. But this is provided that people can receive support to address the underlying factors that contribute to their offending behaviour, such as their alcohol and other drug problems and their mental health problems. However, the extent to which rehabilitation is an aim in sentencing repeat offenders, this reflects on the wider community and our response as a society to people who overwhelmingly have been really significantly impacted by their own experiences of trauma and abuse and maltreatment. So to conclude, judges' remarks provide this really interesting, unique insight into the decisions of legal experts deciding over some of these most difficult things to tease apart. Although judges may express conservative views, the majority prioritise rehabilitation as an aim in sentencing high-risk offenders. It's encouraging that most judges expressed compassion towards offenders charged with these most serious of crimes, and that they acknowledge the impact of drug and alcohol dependence on offending and violent behaviour. So I would like to thank and acknowledge my PhD supervisors and co-authors on this study, Dr. Emma Barrett, Dr. Lexine Stepinski, and Professor Marie Thiessen. Also to our collaborator on this study, Associate Professor David Bright. And there were a few people who provided in-kind support and guidance on this study that I'm really grateful to, particularly Associate Professor Philip Chung from Osley, who was so generous with his time. Dr. Danielle Tyson, Dr. Kari Lancaster, and Miss Leanne Piper. And I'd also like to acknowledge funding from support from the UNSW CMTS Scholarship and the Matilda Centre PhD Scholarship. All right, so now I'll hand over to Daniel. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Daniel McFadden and I'm an MPhil medicine candidate here in the Matilda Centre. And I'm also a research officer with Justice Health and Forensic Mental Health Network. And I'm going to be presenting today on changing beliefs, reducing risk. So before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge my supervisors, Dr. Emma Barrett from the Matilda Centre and Dr. Katrina Pryor, also from the Matilda Centre. And I'd like to acknowledge the Health Education and Training Institute who funded this research along with the New South Wales Mental Health Commission, as well as that also to my employers, Justice Health and Forensic Mental Health Network. I'd like to acknowledge all staff and individuals with a lived experience who contributed to the development of this protocol also. So, this is the title of the project. So it's Protocol for a Pilot Evaluation of a Cognitive Behavioural Therapy-Based Dual Diagnosis Substance Use Treatment Program for Mentally Disordered Offenders in a Secure Forensic Hospital. So obviously that's quite a big mouthful, but I'm going to break it down over the course of the presentation and make it a bit more accessible. So who are mentally ill offenders or forensic patients? So these are mental health patients who've been found not guilty by reason of mental illness of an unlawful act. Okay, so all these patients have been diagnosed with a severe mental illness, but the difference is that the criminal act is agreed to have occurred, but there's no criminal culpability along with it. So an unlawful act could be a criminal act such as murder, sexual assault, or armed robbery. So the Secure Forensic Hospital, which is the pilot site, it's a 135-bed, high-secure environment. There's 17 female beds and 6 adolescent beds. And then the rest of the hospital is divided up for 112 male beds. So these are broken into acute, subacute, rehabilitation, and long stay, and also rehabilitation. So as you can see here, the beaches are named after the units are named after the beaches of Sydney, and that's something that the patients voted upon themselves. It's quite a good system. It's always worked for us, apart from one occasion where I asked for a interpreter for a mental health review tribunal to come to DY, and they ended up in DY Beach. So that's been the only inconvenience so far. Apart from that, it's a pretty good system. It's a very large therapeutic environment, so there's really extensive facilities there. There's an art room, a music room, education room, a very large swimming pool, a gym, a football pitch, a chicken coop, horticultural area, and more recently we've had a stage installed as well. So there's a space for many activities, and we have many resources to engage the patients in these activities as well, which is really great. So just getting back to the substance use element of the project. So reasons why people use drugs. So you can see there's a number of different reasons. Alleviate boredom, peer pressure, feelings of euphoria. So all the reasons that any individual in society might use drugs. And mental health patients have some more specific ones that can also influence them, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them now. So there's self-medication, psychosocial factors, and also supersensitivity. So self-medication was proposed by Edward Kansian in 1975. So that's basically just a theory saying that mental health patients have symptoms which they use drugs and alcohol to alleviate or ameliorate. And for example, with schizophrenic patients, they have what we call negative symptoms, which is, quite amotivated, and they may use psychoactive substances to try and give them more energy and that type of thing. And that's what Kantian is saying there. The next one then is psychosocial factors. So that's basically saying that there's a number of different social factors in the community for mental health patients, which would influence them to use alcohol and drugs. So that may be to do with where their housing is located and the drug culture in those areas, and the fact that they're isolated might be seeking more social connection and can get drawn into drug culture in that way and may end up using alcohol and drugs more easily in that way. And then the final one is supersensitivity. So that this model basically argues that they have a biological vulnerability due to their psychiatric disorder, which makes them more sensitive to smaller amounts of drugs and alcohol, and therefore they tend to use more. So forensic patients and dual diagnosis. So how much of a problem is this basically? So we can see here that there's a 2018 survey done of the New South Wales Secure Hospital, and that showed that 75% of patients met the criteria for substance use disorder. So obviously quite a big proportion of the cohort. We've seen similar statistics reported in Victoria and also in the UK. We're seeing similar numbers, about 75%. So why is this such a problem? Why is it so much harder to be a dual diagnosis forensic patient with alcohol and drug comorbidity as opposed to a general forensic patient? So the research tells us that dual diagnosis patients are more likely to have more extensive criminal histories, more likely to be treated with antidepressants, and are also more likely to be diagnosed with an antisocial personality disorder. So you can see as the dual diagnosis comes in, the clinical complexity of the patient increases. So we have here quite a large sample as forensic patients goes. So this was 959 forensic patients who were discharged from a medium secure unit in the UK. Okay, they were followed over 24 months after discharge, and 142 of those were reconvicted, so 15% were reconvicted. When you look at the patients who were reconvicted, we can see that 79% of those who were reconvicted have been using drugs since their release into the community. So when compared with those who weren't reconvicted, this was quite significant. We can also see then when you look at alcohol use, that 49% were using alcohol. Again, compared with the patients who weren't reconvicted in that period, it was a lot more significant. So we can see that it really plays a role in recidivism post-release into the community as well. So it's quite an important issue amongst forensic patients. So what do we do now? What's the sort of state of things at the moment? So in the New South Wales Forensic Hospital, we have a psychoeducational treatment program in place. Looking at the literature that's out there in relation to this, it's universally accepted that psychoeducation is largely ineffective and doesn't have an association with cognitive or behavioural change amongst mentally ill offenders. Over the last 15 years, particularly in the UK and Ireland, there's been a push to sort of improve this level of service provision, and there have been improvements in the last 15 years, but even recent surveys as far as 2015 have shown that we're still not quite where we need to be, and there's more space to work on this. So what is the best approach then? So there's really strong empirical support for cognitive behavioural therapy and motivational interviewing as a treatment for substance use disorder. That's very well founded, and there's real good evidence for integrated approaches in general mental health as well, so tackling these things head on. There have been many studies so far, so we can see here that as far back as 2008 in forensic settings, Derry et al. Had completed one of the first studies in this area, which showed that which showed quite positive findings, but there was a very small sample size of this type of treatment amongst forensic patients. As we go on, then more studies were cropping up. In 2009, there was another such evaluation, and we've seen high acceptability, mostly through qualitative data, and because no collective outcomes were reported upon, which again is a limitation of that study. So then we've seen going forward, there was some more all studies in the UK, Ollie's and Davies, Ritchie et al. In Scotland, again all showing positive reports right up to 2015, where we had Miles et al., which was an evaluation of a program, found improved attitudes and beliefs about substances, less craving for drugs, and also high levels of satisfaction with the program. Okay, so that was obviously quite successful, but out of that again, further multi-site evaluations were recommended, which brings us up to where we're at now today. So the aim of my program is to adapt the substance use treatment program, which was reported upon in that 2015 Miles et al. Study, and adapt it and bring it to an Australian forensic mental health setting. So the hypothesis is that this treatment program will prove acceptable, feasible, and show preliminary efficacy amongst mentally ill offenders in a secure forensic hospital. So this is the substance use treatment program. That's the cover of the manual there. That was actually designed by UK-based forensic mental health patients who designed the cover for Helen. So it's a 12-session cognitive behavioural therapy-based treatment program. The facilitation of the program is underpinned by the technique of motivational interviewing. As you can see there, we can have a list of the different sessions. So start off with building motivation for change. We do psychoeducation. Psychoeducation is important. It's a foundation for change, but it's not the only agent. So then we move on to more self-esteem building, looking at a functional analysis of substance use, assertiveness, craving, risk to relapse and recommitting after relapse, and relapse prevention plan. So it's quite an extensive program. So what theory is underpinning the substance use treatment program? So it's the main theory of behavioural change, Prochaska and Norcross, or Prochaska and De Clemente, and this is the trans-theoretical model of change. So that basically focuses on 5 different stages, from pre-contemplation to contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. So it's just an acknowledgement that people are at various levels of readiness in relation to wanting to change something. So people can be in pre-contemplation where they don't realize that, the change needs to be made. They're like, I don't have a problem. To contemplation, being like, oh yeah, okay, maybe I have a problem. There might be something going on here. Preparation, right, how am I going to change? How am I going to make this better? Action, to actually performing the behavior, and then maintenance, keeping it up. Always keeping it up. And at any point in that chain of events, there is opportunity for relapse, recycling, where patients might step back a couple of stages, and there's also opportunity to move forward again after that. So it's not linear and definite. It's always moving. And so the treatment program that we're piloting is designed to enhance motivation by resolving ambivalence and moving individuals in the direction of change behaviours, and giving them the knowledge and skills to be able to do this. We're trying to move them up through that chain there. And so how do they link together? So basically we have SUTP stage 1, which correlates with phase 1 and that pre-contemplation, contemplation element of behaviour change. So at this point, we're really trying to just build that motivation to change. Then SUTP stage 2, it's about strengthening the commitment to change and how to do it. So we're in the planning preparation stage, getting patients ready. And then phase 3, which is also SUTP stage 2, it's about making and maintaining change. So we're in the action and maintenance stage at that place. So the treatment program is all aligned up with those different stages of change. So again, why group therapy? Why do this in a group as opposed to doing it, one-on-one, apart from economic reasons? So again, there's so many, good qualities to group therapy, because they have the opportunity, patients have the opportunity for peer support, and having been a former clinician in the forensic hospital, it's really vital for patients to get that from each other in order to progress and to do well, and for their own sense of self-esteem. That group cohesiveness is really important. Also, we find that there's increased levels of catharsis in group work. They really have that opportunity to talk about things, and that's bolstered by the peer support also. And then other factors like installation of hope, the change is possible, and the general education qualities as well. So it was really important through our partnership with the New South Wales Mental Health Commission to design and deliver this treatment program in partnership with individuals with a lived experience of mental illness. So what was done was an advisory board. It was coalesced of peer workers, peer consultants, and also Mr. Sunny Hemraj, the New South Wales Consumer Advisory Group member, who consulted in the treatment manual and advised around what adaptations we could make to make it more recovery oriented and related to people with a lived experience. So they provided some really valuable consultation throughout the process, and ensured really respectful and recovery-oriented language. So just a little sort of snapshot of what kind of changes did we make. So one was that there was no recovery-oriented language guide for facilitators within the manual. So we changed this, we put a recovery-oriented language guide in. Some wording, just like positive and negative, was changed to helpful and unhelpful. And equally things like words like irritable were changed to agitated, because peer workers and peer consultants found that language a bit more accessible throughout the process. Another part, obviously, in forensic mental health settings, we also have overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations. So consultation with Aboriginal mental health worker and Aboriginal academics occurred throughout the process. Vignettes were adapted to be more relatable and better reflect the challenges faced by Aboriginal forensic patients in relation to substance use, particularly as they look towards their discharge into the community. And then an Aboriginal mental health worker provides cultural support to all Aboriginal patients engaged in the treatment program and throughout the treatment process, which is also a great resource that we have in the forensic hospital. So the pilot itself, we have 38 participants who are doing it at the moment, and the pilot commenced on the 16th of September 2019, and it's currently on week 8 of treatment. So it's continuing on. There's about 4 sessions left after this. So I suppose I think it's really important to note here, what is the potential, what's the impact for forensic hospital patients? How are they really going to benefit from this, enhanced service provision? So currently the risk assessments are the primary determinants of how patients progress through the forensic hospital. So there are the HCR20 and the Dundrum. So within those, we have categories like recent problems with insight, recent problems with treatment and supervision response, drugs and alcohol, stability, insight. So basically, the SUTP has demonstrated in the past through its pilot in the UK that it can cause patients to change their beliefs around substances. So if this can occur, then patients can move through the stages of change, i.e. they can go from pre-contemplation, as in I don't have a problem, to contemplation, okay, there might be an issue here. And this will take down their risk level when we look at them through the lens of a HCR20 or Dundrum risk assessment. So theoretically then, patients could move through the forensic hospital faster with an evidence-based program that can cause change like this to happen. If proven efficacious, this program is ready to be embedded within the forensic hospital treatment pathway, which is also a real plus. So that's everything. Thank you very much for listening. That's my email address accessible there, and any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Daniel and Siobhan. That was fantastic. I'd now like to invite everybody listening along to type in any questions that you might have for Siobhan and Daniel in your questions tab that you'll see down the bottom there. So feel free to type those in and we'll get the question and answer session rolling. We've had a few come in as you've both been talking. And I'd like to start off perhaps with a question directed to Siobhan about rehabilitation options for young people. So the question is if you know of any options specifically for young people and the success rates or reoffending rates that might be associated with the current rehabilitation options we have.
Sure. Yeah, really good question. Thank you. Well, I guess if we're talking about young adults in particular, then an example of a rehabilitation program that's quite well known, I guess, would be the Merit program, and that program is like an alternative to court. So it's a program for offenders to address their drug and alcohol problems that are directly related to their offending behaviour, and it's decided by judges in the local court. And depending on how they go with the program, they can avoid a custodial sentence if they progress well and meet the expectations. I think there was a review by Sarah Lani on this from NDARC some time ago now, showing that it was associated with, completion of the program was associated with about a 30% reduction in reoffending, which is pretty significant. But yeah, I should say actually that violent offenders, they tend not to be eligible for these types of diversionary treatment programs, and there's various reasons for this. This is to do with the community safety, as well as the safety of the people that are running these programs and the people that are participating in them, the other participants. But at the end of the day, we know there is actually evidence to show that people charged with violent crime can actually really benefit from these types of programs. So, at some point, 99% of prisoners are going to be released, and it's really in the interests of community safety to be investing in these evidence-based rehabilitation programs, such as what Daniel had been talking about. This is really in our interests. But I'll just say one more thing quickly, sorry, about youth diversionary programs for younger people. So that's this sort of clear narrative that needs to come out, is that young people need to be diverted at every opportunity to just keep them out of the criminal justice system. Everything we can be doing to divert young people is what we need to be doing, and the evidence shows that this works. So cautioning schemes, youth conferencing, formal diversion programs that are happening in different states and territories all over Australia. These are effective in reducing reoffending, where young people who are diverted, they are less likely to have recontact than young people who are formally processed through the courts. Yeah, and I've got some papers that I can send through if anyone wants to email me. I'm happy to share those.
Awesome, thanks Siobhan. And related to this, another question's come through, and I'm not sure if you know the answer. It's quite a specific question, but the person was asking if you know of any rehabilitation programs that cater for young adults who might have intellectual disabilities and be using substances and engaging in minor criminal behaviours. I'm not sure if you're aware of anything specifically related to that.
No, I'm not, I'm sorry, off the top of my head, but I would be very happy to have a look, and if you just want to shoot me an email, I can check out what I can find and share some information with you.
Awesome, thanks Siobhan. So Daniel, we've had a question come through in relation to your program. Someone's asked whether individuals on opioid substitution or maintenance therapy are included in the program, and if so, what proportion of the sample with or without opioid treatment?
Yeah, patients aren't excluded based on whether they're on methadone maintenance or Suboxone or anything like that. I don't actually have the demographic statistics around who is on opioid treatment in the pilot. That's something that hopefully I will have by the time the paper is published. So maybe keep a lookout for the publication of the study, and I'll have that data sort of collected and properly looked at that time.
Awesome. And Daniel, what's the next step once the pilot study is completed? What's the next, or the plans for the project going forward?
Yeah, well, this is, I suppose, a phase 1 pilot study that's mainly looking at acceptability, feasibility, and sort of just that preliminary efficacy. And the next thing, in order to be able to properly sort of give a study the power to make the findings generalizable, would be a randomized controlled trial. There's no immediate plans to do that, but it's something that we'll be looking at in the future. Also, further multi-site evaluations are always welcome of the substance use treatment program. And places like Ireland and other countries are interested at the moment. So we're always looking to evaluate different sites as well.
Okay, awesome, fantastic. And we've had a comment come through from Amy, who's actually suggested a DBT-based skill book called Emotional Regulation for Cognitively Challenged Clients, which we apparently you can use for comorbid mental health and AOD concerns. So I'm thinking I might look into that, and we could potentially send that link around with the webinar slides too, if people are interested in checking that out. So thank you, Amy, for suggesting that.
Thank you.
So we've had another question for Siobhan. I was wondering if there's any differences depending on drug or offence type in how judges talked about rehabilitation.
Thanks. That's actually a question that I get quite a bit around this study. I've looked into it, and I didn't have any statistical power to detect sort of like significant differences, but qualitatively speaking, there were some kind of interesting things that emerged. So for judges who were talking a lot about choice, the types of drugs, the primary drugs involved in these, they were cannabis, and crime, in terms of crime, it was homicide, the choice. Yeah, and then for judges that were talking a lot more about dependence, these were more financially motivated crimes and crimes involving methamphetamine. Whereas where we're talking about assault and alcohol use, it was kind of 50-50 in terms of whether judges were more likely to talk about choice or dependence. So yeah, I actually think that it's really interesting, that kind of emerging from the data. sort of more compassionate or sympathetic views towards methamphetamine-related crime and financially motivated crime. And given a lot of these occurred in rural towns, maybe it's sort of reflecting what's been happening in Australia over the last 10 years or so. There's been some research and a lot of media attention to sort of, like ice epidemic in country Australia. And, like we do see higher rates of methamphetamine use among young adults in rural parts of Australia. And, there's various reasons why this might be, and some of these are, it's just associated with isolation and lack of services and lack of opportunity for people in these areas. But yeah, I could speculate and say that maybe, this sort of increased awareness around these issues is sort of leading parts of the judiciary to having a more compassionate stance when it comes to methamphetamine-related crime, and seeing it as more like a national problem, national challenge, rather than an individual-specific problem. But yeah, I couldn't say for sure.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Daniel, can I ask if there are any indications of patient satisfaction levels with the program that came out of the pilot?
Yeah, well, we're on week 8 at the moment, and just sort of anecdotally talking to facilitators and stuff, patients are demonstrating or showing really high levels of satisfaction with the program compared to the other more psychoeducation programs that they'd be used to in the forensic hospital. One of the particular sessions was focused on taking a liver and showing the impact of alcohol on a liver. And we'd kind of soaked it overnight in alcohol, and then it had been brought in and shown to the patients through the alcohol session. And that had a really big impact on some of our patients. Some of them, really struggled to look at it. And, the smell association between alcohol and the visual image of the liver that had been sort of, slightly destroyed by the alcohol was really strong for them. And, sort of in the feedback after that session, a lot of the patients were just discussing how impactful that session had been on them in terms of how they were interpreting it. So from a general satisfaction level, they're already displaying quite high levels. And then also just in terms of the impact it's having on them, they're reporting back to their treating teams that it is having an impact on how they're thinking about things and how they've thought about alcohol and how it impacts in their body. So overall, so far, very positive.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you both so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise and sharing this fascinating research. Apologies to those who we didn't get time to answer your questions. We had lots of fantastic questions coming through, and apologies if we didn't quite get to all of them. But I'd like to thank both Siobhan and Daniel for their presentations and time today, as well as everybody who joined us. Just a reminder, we will send out the recordings and make the slides available today, but if you do have any further questions or want to follow up on any of the information presented today, please do get in touch and we can put you in touch with Siobhan and Daniel as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. Please follow along and join our mailing list to be informed about upcoming and future webinars, and we look forward to having you join us again. Thanks everybody.